June 26, 2023 special Troy City Council meeting. I will call the meeting to order and ask for the roll call from Ms. Stewart.
Mayor Baker?
Here.
Councilmember Abraham?
Here.
Councilmember Brooks?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Chamberlain Krianga?
Here.
Councilmember Erickson Gall?
Here.
Councilmember Hamilton?
Here.
Councilmember Hoderick?
Here.
All present this evening. First up is public comment. Anyone choose to speak for public comment this evening? All right, Fabrice, come on up. You have 3 minutes, same rules as in the council chambers. Speak into the microphone. It's not amplified, but it's for the watchers at home.
Great, so I had the chance to read through the draft master plan that was submitted as part of an earlier city council meeting. And I liked it a lot. I made a number of comments. Hopefully these were passed through some of the council members to the staff. Hopefully they were useful. There were like 7 comments on sustainability. Maybe I'll focus on 3 just to be a little bit focused. The 3 that I think might be the most impactful changes that could be made to this master plan. So number 1, electric vehicle ridership in Troy. So Sterling Heights is running rings around us right now on electric vehicles. They have released a EV master plan with plans to install a number of charging stations and encourage the adoption of EVs in the city. Troy could do far more. We have so many engineers who live here who have bought into the concept of EVs, but we haven't done much concretely to actually support EVs. So what we could do in particular would be to change zoning ordinances to sort of facilitate the installation of EV chargers in housing developments, in commercial property. We could mandate that new developments, new mixed-use developments, new multifamily developments, have a certain percentage of their parking spots be EV ready, as other communities have done. And I think something that could really raise the profile of EVs in the city would be to install a supercharger, probably on the Big Beaver corridor, either at Somerset or maybe just next to I-75, that would really make EV ownership visible to the community, spurring adoption, but also bring in residents to shop, to retail within our fine venues on the Big Beaver corridor that we want to encourage use of. A second thing that I think is important is to facilitate the use of solar and the adoption of solar in the city. And so we should just make it easier to adopt solar. So I was trying to buy a property last year in Heatherwood Sub. They have a homeowners association. What they told me was, I said, I want to buy this house conditional on being able to install solar on my property. They said, sorry, we can't promise you that. The HOA has to review this. It'll take us a few weeks. Oh, and by the way, your offer is going to be either accepted or rejected in the next 2 days. So an HOA should not be able to do that. An HOA should not be able to refuse solar installation on anyone's house. That's one sort of very concrete example, but in general we should make it easier to get the permits to install solar on any property in the city, commercial, residential, etc. And the last thing I was going to suggest is sort of, we have the possibility of creating new zoning categories to enhance sustainability. In particular, community resilience hubs. During those moments when the power goes out, which are increasingly frequent in the city, there should be hubs in the city, probably schools, maybe churches, that would be power on at all times through solar energy generation, and that the community could come to when they need to. And finally, community solar is a type of new project that is going to be very likely mandated in law or passed, legislated at the state level. And we should create a zoning possibility for community solar installations in Troy.
Thank you, Fabrice. Appreciate you bringing this forward. And we did see, I know all of us did see the comments you submitted there. I believe. I think they came through, but we did see it, so thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Did you have any comments? You don't have to if you don't. Just
Say, I wanted to hear everything that was going to be said first, then I might.
Fair enough. Well, there'll be an opportunity for public comment at our next council meeting. It starts at 7:30 as well. So if you hear something that happens during the presentation, you're welcome to stick around and speak at the 7:30 meeting during public comment. Okay? All right, that concludes public comment for now. Next up is business stated in the special meeting notice. We have one item this evening, D1, draft master plan discussion. It's my understanding that Brent is still traveling, so we've got Ben here, of course, which is fine and wonderful.
Thank you.
More than fine, Ben. Sorry, I didn't mean it like that.
Fine, I'll take fine, that's fine.
And of course, we have Deputy City Manager Bruner here as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Bob, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I want to start off just a couple of minutes about talking about process. And then Ben's going to talk about product and bookend it with more process. I'll take big picture process. The current process that we're in sort of indirectly started in 2016. That was the last time the city of Troy, Troy City Council specifically, approved amendments to the master plan. Councilmember Abraham was on that council, Mayor Baker, you were on that council, and Councilmember Hoderick was on that council. It's nearly 7 years ago, so I won't hold you to remembering the process. But once that master plan was adopted, that started a 5-year clock running, because the Michigan Planning Enabling Act says at least every 5 years after the adoption, the Planning Commission needs to review its master plan and determine whether or not to make changes. So 2016 plus 5 is 2021. That's when the current efforts to update the master plan began, and unfortunately have kind of dragged on due to COVID-related delays and other reasons. But the process for updating the master plan is set by that statute, the Michigan Planning Enabling Act. Article 3 of the act governs preparation and adoption of master plans. It's more than a third of the act is devoted to that. And out of, there's 11 sections in the act, or in that article. And planning commissions are mentioned 10 out of those 11 sections. In legislative body, which is what the city council is only mentioned twice. So there's 2 specific sections where the legislative body is more engaged in the process than through those other sections. So the phase that we're in right now is what you might call the preparation of the proposed master plan. The Planning Commission has prepared it and has submitted it to the City Council for review and comment. And the process can't proceed any further unless the legislative body approves the distribution of the proposed master plan. There is no mechanism to do anything else. If the City Council doesn't distribute it, approve the distribution, we're kind of stuck in this limbo. And this is also the section where the whole 63-day comment period comes into play. So the next phase that we're trying to get to is what you might think of as the approval or rejection phase. And that's where the Planning Commission is holding a public hearing, and actually the approval of the proposed master plan can stop with Planning Commission approval. The legislative bodies like City Council has the option of saying we want to reject it or accept it. And there's a process for doing that, and for basically reconciliation if the Planning Commission and the City Council have different ideas about what ought to be in the master plan. But we're not there yet. We're in the preparation phase. So in that approval or rejection phase, the Planning Commission will submit the proposed master plan to the City Council again. And it'll kind of feel like deja vu. And then there's, other paths City Council can go from there. But I just wanted to try to provide some clarity on the overall process. Oh, and then the 5-year clock starts ticking again, and we do it over and over and over again. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben, who will tell you a little more about the proposed master plan.
Thank you. Good evening. Mr. Mayor, do you mind if I sit here and do it, or would you rather have me stand up?
Whatever makes you comfortable, Ben.
I'll sit here, a little more casual. First of all, I want to thank you for your comments. Those are great comments. I have not received them, but I assume I'll get them through the city, and so incorporate many of those. So appreciate that insight. I got a short presentation. It's going to seem pretty redundant to what I gave to you guys last month, but I really want to hear from you after this for questions and kind of get your thoughts. So I'm going to try to go through this as quick as possible and allow time for some dialogue. So why do we plan? We plan for a city no different than you plan for anything in life, whether it's a financial plan or something of that nature. You do it to create a vision for the future. What do you want to be? It's an aspirational document. It's used to anticipate change. We are constantly in an environment of changing, but how do we best anticipate and prepare for those changes coming up? With change, we try to create predictability too. We know things are going to change, but how do we set ourselves up for a predictable future? The city, like many of us, or all of us, has finite resources, but whether that be financially, fiscally, natural, social, etc. You have scarce resources, limited resources. So how do we provide those in the most wise manner? And lastly is to protect the environment and quality of life. And we spent a lot of time talking about those two aspects in our master plan. And the environment and quality of life is much more focused on now than what master plans were 20, 30, 40 years ago. They're pretty much back in the day just land use. Like this is where this goes, this is where this goes. We've had a much broader approach to planning in the last 20 to 30 years just because our cities are so dynamic, and then we were trying to recognize that. According to the state of Michigan, in the Enabling Act, it's the only official document that a city or municipality will take that sets forth the agenda for the achievement of land use goals and policies. All you have to do legally in a master plan is talk about land use and zoning. Again, we are doing much more than that, but according to the state of Michigan, this is what you have to focus on is land use and its goals. But the most important thing in this whole sentence is it's the only official document adopted by a municipality to state those. When the Planning Commission opened up the master plan and started digging into it in 2020 and 2021, they felt that it was consistent and relevant to what the city overall wanted to achieve. And it did not need or require a overhaul or comprehensive update. Last one that was comprehensive update was 2008. Typically we do comprehensive updates about every 20 years, so maybe we'll start talking about doing the comprehensive update with the next one. But right now, the Planning Commission felt like it was in a pretty good spot with where it is, and it really is consistent with city goals and policies. However, there were some tweaks that wanted to be made, and first and foremost was reviewing the neighborhood notes. Obviously, that's something that has come to your attention in the past 5 years. It's something that the Planning Commission is wrestling with since its adoption. So really, the focus of this plan was on the neighborhood nodes. Again, to review the intent of them, review each node individually, and then provide some concept plans to show what are we trying to achieve with the neighborhood nodes. In addition to that, we did update the look and layout, the introduction about the connection between the zoning ordinance and the master plan, because sometimes that gets lost in the details. And then again, updated outdated information as it became available. But again, the focus really was on these nodes. So then the node review process was really a 5-step process. The first is we did a community survey. Then we did 6 walking nodes with the Planning Commission and the public. We formed a steering committee that met 4 times. We had a city council tour, which I believe all of you attended that. And lastly, we started to get into the plan drafting after all these steps. So the survey was a wide distribution. We got a very good response back on that. It was used really for 2 purposes. One was to gather community input as to where we were specifically. Again, we focused more on the node questions. And then lastly, it was used to inform how we wanted to tackle the master plan update with the steering committee and the Planning Commission. We focused our efforts in terms of what's important and what wasn't important. We then led, based on the survey results, we led 6 walking tours of various nodes in the community, and they were selected for 2 reasons. Some were selected because they were identified in the survey as areas of particular importance. Crooks and Wattles, I think, comes to everyone's attention. And then some were chosen because they were unique in perspective, like Long Lake and Livernois. And some were chosen because they were pretty good indicators of what we could do in similar nodes throughout the city. We knew we couldn't hit all 21 nodes. So we want to focus on those that we could replicate strategies and processes with other nodes that we couldn't visit. So we had 6 tours. They were very well attended. I'm not sure if a council member was at any of the 6 tours of the Planning Commission and the public, but each one had members of the Planning Commission and the public that attended them. There were 4 members of the steering committee. They included the vice chair and the chair of the Planning Commission. They met 3 times during the process to discuss the vision of the master plan. They focused mostly again on the nodes. So they tackled 3 main things. They revised the note intent statement. They reviewed each node individually. We went node by node, going through the specific language of each node to update it to best reflect the vision of what we want to intend. And they provided direction on the concept plans that were included in the plan. So a red line version of the updated node intent statement was included in your packet. And the one I want to focus on, we spent a lot of time talking about this concept, was the nodes were intended to serve the neighborhoods they abut. And that had gotten kind of, we think, lost in the process from when the nodes were initially adopted to where we're at now. Oftentimes they don't serve, they actually inhibit and prohibit certain activities that we want to encourage with adjacent neighborhoods. So we really want to focus again on their intent was to serve and be a beneficiary to the neighborhoods that they directly abut. There was a heavy focus on mixed use. That concept of mixed use got lost a little bit in kind of where we were with the nodes. Focus on first floor commercial and limited residential uses. Obviously, a lot of the node development we've gotten is residential uses, and that really, again, to the point of serving the neighborhoods they abut, we kind of got away from that with all the residential uses. So again, focusing on mixed use, commercial first floor, with some limited residential uses as part of that too. A strong discussion about non-motorized connection, whether that be bicycle and or pedestrian, but again, the connection between the neighborhoods to be served by these nodes should be connected physically with these nodes as well. There's a lot of discussion about creativity and open space planning, pedestrian elements in landscape, and again, to soften those nodes to make them more of a people place, again, to serve neighborhoods. And then we spent a lot of time in talking about transition. Multiple story buildings should be at the front on the corridor with less intense buildings as they abut residential behind them. And again, landscaping and open space is a great buffer between various land uses in these areas. So there was a significant discussion on transition, because when we got developments in the nodes, the transition between the development and the neighborhoods was what people were most concerned about and most focused on. And so we really want to stress there needs to be a transition, both from building massing, et cetera, but other physical forms to really separate those different types of areas. As I noted, we did go through and update and looked at every single node individually, and a red line of those changes were in your council packet. The discussion of the steering committee was to look at each node individually based on their context and the character of where they were now, what their historical past were, and what we anticipated the future vision of that was going to be. And so you will see we talk a lot about specific parcels in these nodes in our intent statement. Really, it was a very deep dive into what we wanted to see at these individual nodes. And that actually led us to recommend removing 6 nodes. And these were DeQuinter and 14, Rochester and Wattles, Livernois and Wattles, Rochester and Long Lake, Livernois and Long Lake, and Rochester and South. You'll see there's kind of a cluster right in the middle of the 4, and then the two at the kind of the periphery of the city. The reason was that, this was existing conditions, specifically of the road network where these nodes were located on, made them difficult to achieve the vision that we want to achieve in the nodes. It would dilute the purpose of the nodes to have these exist. They were boulevard roads, heavy traffic volume, limited pedestrian ability, limited ability to connect to neighborhoods, etc. And so the intent was let's take these out and really strengthen and focus on the nodes that we think were capable to meet the vision of what we want to do in the future. So those are the nodes that were taken out, and with that, we did a review of the existing land use and building pattern to make that determination as well. So this is the updated map of the remaining 15 nodes. You'll note the ones that I talked about are taken out, and now we have those 15. We also produced three concept plans, and I often say that a picture is much better, easier to understand what we're trying to achieve than words can. And so we created two to show a mixed-use kind of environment, show some architectural quality that we're trying to achieve, show the transitions of intensity between the commercial and the single-family neighborhoods, showed infill development where you'd infill existing parking lots that are over-parked to make more of a place for people, and lastly showed the landscape buffers. We also showed a third concept plan to show a gateway intersection at DeQuinder and South, and the reason that came up was actually in the 6 tours that we took with the Planning Commission, the ones that were on the periphery of the city, the gateways, they just thought that there was not a good welcome to Troy feel in a lot of those areas. And through development, we may be able to achieve some of those. So landscaping, public art, lighting, etc., pedestrian improvements, just to say, hey, welcome to Troy, a gateway to Troy. Other updates, again, refreshed font, layout, pictures, again, the introduction, the connection between the master plan and design ordinance. And lastly, outdated language, demographic, and other information. I will also note that in between the time this was released to you and the Planning Commission, the census data has come out, and so we can update it, after this, we can update it based on the new census data that just got released. They were a couple years behind on that. So, that's good. If this moves forward, at some point, the 63-day release gets moved forward, we then can do a separate and ongoing engagement phase. That includes the master plan webpage launch, which I believe is ready to go once we get the okay to release this. We'll also include displays in the library, community center, and city hall, and any other locations you think or the community thinks would be worthwhile places. We started to put together a video series. There's going to be new content. Will be running about 8 weeks. I think there's 6 or 7 videos that are going to be running through the 8 weeks, and these will be continually rotated. We'll do social media blasts through those 8 weeks, and they'll be obviously constantly rotated and updated. And then we'll do a media distribution and public press release, etc. Okay, so Bob kind of went into this. This is where we're at now. The next step to continue this process is the master plan is distributed for a 63-day review period. I want to stress again, that does not mean that anyone, the city or otherwise, is adopting the plan. You are simply saying, hey, let's get this out for review and public comment and allow the public engagement process to comment on the plan to start. Once the 63-day period expires, then the Planning Commission can hold a public hearing. The Planning Commission can't hold a public hearing before the 63-day. However, if there are significant changes and we need more time, the public hearing can take place 90 days, 120 days, whatever it is. It just can't take place within the 63-day period. So there is some extra time after the 63-day that we can still make edits and changes and still wait to hold a public hearing. If we're comfortable with it and we're ready for the public hearing, the Planning Commission is the public body that holds the public hearing, and they then at some point will make a recommendation back to the City Council, and then the City Council will hopefully adopt the master plan via a resolution. So as Mr. Bruner noted, there are 2 times statutorily that the legislative body inserts themselves in the planning process. The first is the release of the 63-day review period, and the second is the adoption. That doesn't mean you shouldn't or couldn't comment or get engaged in other places, but those are the 2 statutory places where the legislative body gets involved. I think that's it.
Thanks, Ben.
Yep.
Okay, so I think the question coming out of here tonight is, I was thinking, it's been 5 weeks since our meeting when we first saw this plan, so we've had 5 weeks to digest a lot of this, or I hope we have, taken the last 5 weeks. But the question I think for tonight is, what is gonna make each of us comfortable in getting to that point where we're releasing and distributing for the 63-day plan? I mean, because that's all, or at least 4 of us comfortable. But I mean, that's where we're at, right? We need to get to that next step. And I think I have a little bit better understanding based on what I did 5 weeks ago. It felt a little bit 5 weeks ago, one, that as soon as we distributed it, that was kind of it for us. There's been some clarification, I think, on that. It definitely takes it to the next step, but that doesn't mean there's not gonna be changes, and there's public hearing, and there's planning commission, all kinds of things. The other thing, so that question, I think we need to kind of come up with some kind of consensus tonight on where we're at after some discussion. I'm gonna just say this, I strongly feel that we should get this done this year, if possible. It's been 107 years or something since the last one, it feels like, but I mean, I know that we took 5 extra weeks by doing what we're doing tonight, but the closer I think we can get to getting this process done and wrapped up this year, I think the better for our city. And so with that, let's open it up to council questions, comments. Let's start. Teresa went first. Teresa had her hand
Go
up
ahead.
first.
Go ahead.
Well, I just had some other questions about the process. So, for example, there's a lot of language pertaining to the neighborhood nodes. And so eventually we would have to change the zoning ordinance to reflect that language. Is that correct?
Not necessarily.
Okay,
So the master plan is a policy document,
okay.
right? And so it's a vision of what you want to be. It's not a regulatory document. The zoning ordinance is a regulatory document. Your zoning ordinance often gets updated after a master plan. I think we will update some of the language of the nodes based on what gets adopted in the master plan. But the zoning ordinance does not have to mirror what the master plan says with regards to regulatory. It should be consistent, but it's not a one-for-one mirror that we have to update the zoning ordinance to be exactly like the master plan. But we will update, for example, one of the recommendations of the master plan is that limited residential uses in a node. We will have to go back through the zoning ordinance and kind of call or pull out some residential uses that are currently allowed in the node to be reflective and updated what we want it to be and what the master plan calls for. So little tweaks like that will happen, but I don't think there's a need to do a whole-scale replacement of the node language in the zoning ordinance. It's more tweaks based on what we're doing in the master plan.
Okay.
That clarify?
That does. So for example, if we were to say, adopt some of the recommendations that Fabrice had made about the EV charging stations, and we made those recommendations in the master document, how would that be binding or?
Nope. So again, the master plan is a policy document. I think your city attorney will tell you it's always good to be consistent between your zoning ordinance and your master plan. So if the master plan then talks about EV charging and other things, yeah, it's a good time at that point to put some language in the zoning ordinance that would require it to be consistent with the master plan. Not required, but certainly good policy to always update your zoning ordinance after your master plan is adopted to make sure there's consistency between the two. So, because the thing about this, the master plan is your vision, how you want to do it. The zoning ordinance is how you actually implement that vision.
Yes.
And so, if the vision is for EV charging, which is a great vision, strong support, let's put in the zoning ordinance to require it too. That's how they match up.
Just a quick follow-up to that, though. The nodes that we're removing from neighborhood nodes, those are currently zoned NN, right?
Those are zone NN, and we would have to go back and
Those lots of
rezone those
yeah.
back to a consistent zoning district or designation, yeah.
So that would be a zone.
Yeah, and same thing happened in 2008. In the master plan, we named all these neighborhood nodes, and then the zoning ordinance after that went through and rezoned all these properties to neighborhood nodes.
So the nodes began with the 2008?
2008.
2015. Okay.
2008, yeah.
Okay.
But they didn't really start happening, I think, or they didn't become an issue until later.
Post-recession.
Well, 2008, they
already existed.
Yeah, and they were, the 2008 master plan talks a lot about the node concept, the idea, and then that was implemented in the 2010 or 11 zoning ordinance update. Yeah.
Teresa, do you have something else at the moment?
Yes, I do have another question too. So I know there's a lot of focus on the neighborhood nodes, but there were some other areas in the city that were having some issues with kind of, commercial, kind of abutting residential. So are we also addressing some of these other areas, like maybe in the downtown district, you know, Big Beaver
Big Beaver,
corridor and things
yeah.
like that?
We've been talking about Big Beaver and Big Beaver transition since 2008 and 2010, so it's a constant thing on our radar. That being said, we feel comfortable right now that the Big Beaver section of the master plan and the Big Beaver corridor plan gives us, is written in such a way that we can make zoning ordinance changes to ensure that that transition is better handled in the future. So we didn't think we actually need to make master plan changes to those two sections of the document itself to address that concern.
Okay. I was just wondering, because I mean, some of the buffering and things like that were nice with the neighborhood notes, and I wondered if it could also translate to maybe other
Yep.
areas as well.
Yeah.
That was, I'll let other people ask a question.
Oh.
Those are good questions and somewhat related. Related to the Big Beaver buffering, we had the one area where we really ran into it with residents.
Yep.
And part of that is because there had been the Monarch proposal, but that changed and instead Satchin Way,
Yep.
more residential ended out there. Is it changed in the master plan or would it be in the zoning document that we could, my shorthand, fix that?
Mm-hmm.
While I know that's conceptual,
Mm-hmm.
that is something, you know, there's lots of engagement with residents.
Yep.
Years ago on this, we know sitting at the table, even if they're not here speaking at the microphone, they're expecting us to represent that. If we can, I want that comprehended personally, and I defer, look to my colleagues to see if they agree, but that is an area that, you know, our residents are clamoring for us to represent that to them. So it's somewhat related to what you're talking about, that buffering on Big Beaver. It sounds like you're thinking in those ways.
We are, and there's a couple ways to think or address it. The first way is you have a future land use map, which is the boundary of where your districts should be or supposed to be. So when a rezoning occurs within a certain area of the city, the first thing you look at, or one of the main things you look at, is the future land use plan. Is this consistent? The rezoning, is it consistent with what the future land use plan calls for? If we want to amend the boundaries of the Big Beaver district, you would shrink them a little bit so that they're only maybe on Big Beaver, not one or two parcel deep. That's one way to address it. Second way to address it is to put in stronger language with the transition and the buffering and the landscaping and other things that were talked about in the note. The third way to do it would be to potentially rezone properties that are kind of in that transition area to a more appropriate district. We looked at this, we feel pretty comfortable that the language as is strong enough that we don't need to make any changes to it with regards to this transition issue, and we think we can strengthen it up through some additional zoning regulations such as landscaping and other means. We feel pretty comfortable with it, but certainly if there's concern of this council, that's something that we could certainly look at with that particular district. In zoning, the areas you have the most friction are those areas where you have abutting land uses. I see this in every city or place we work. It's that sweet spot between those districts that are really hard, especially when you have neighborhoods that abut or are one parcel off a major corridor. It's a tough thing to chew because your master plan calls for intensity on the Big Beaver corridor and its vibrancy. You look at some of the really great stuff that's happened in 10, 15 years on Big Beaver. But yet you still have that friction. You don't want to, you need to ensure that there's no impact on the adjacent neighborhoods behind it. So it's on our radar and something that we're very aware of, and we can address it as a concern.
Well, and to be very specific, I think because Satchin Way went in and brought residential into
Yeah.
what would have been, it changed it. It changed the map. And recognizing that and
Yep.
changing that accordingly is, is one council member's opinion, but I think others we lived that. And we continue to hear the concern about it.
I'm not sure it's a good idea to not address that boundary line at all
Okay.
in this 7 years later, based on the hundreds of conversations many of us have had with the residents in that area, but not just that area. It's leaked out into really a good part of the city with concern about that.
Yeah, it's
And I
not just
understand
them.
we're probably being a little tender because for legal reasons and such, and maybe we're not, so, I do think that, I don't think there's ever gonna be a time where those $1 million homes on Sachin Way are gonna be bought as tear downs to build a new Monarch. So I don't think it makes sense to keep that boundary line as the same thing. I think it really is further south of that now, closer to Big Beaver, and those parcels don't even really, it's just,
Yep.
I think we're missing an opportunity to not take a closer look at that, and I appreciate that you have looked at it. I know you have looked at it, because you've dealt with just as many residents and development projects from the planning commission. So I know you're well aware. But that is, to answer my own question, that's one of the things that keeps me from wanting to move forward in this process, is I don't know that that's been properly, or I don't know if I have a comfort level yet to where I think that specific issue has been resolved, or we're any different than we were in 2016 with that issue, that neighborhood, in that area. But again, I'm also just one.
It certainly makes sense, and from my memory, or lack thereof, it seems to be that's the one place we experience the most issues of the Big Beaver district and Beaver zoning. Everywhere else it's been pretty well received, and there's a pretty clear boundary. So I agree with you. I think we have to take a look at it.
I prefer not to have to be sitting in a city council meeting talking to an attorney and explaining why I'm making my decision.
Yep.
And having to put a new imaginary line, we're at that change time. That would be helpful. I have one other, but I'll allow Councilwoman Abraham to go next.
I'm trying to curate my own questions. Another area that has caused a lot of conversation is the large parcel of land on John R., west of John R., north of Big Beaver, between the Kroger's and Braintree, and some of the proposed development and the transition between the residential R1A and B. I want to make sure that that also gets thought through, given some of the conversations that have happened. That one didn't take quite as much flight as some of the other conversations, but I think that's for other reasons. But that has the potential to become a real hot button. And so I think if we can get ahead of it, that would be good. Really thinking about the neighborhood nodes and, you know, the underlying notion of that they're intended to serve the neighborhoods that they have bought. When I look at the map, and I'm thinking about this as a resident who may not have a lot of background, they weren't really paying attention in 2008, 2016, what have you, and they're looking at the map of neighborhood nodes, and they're, you know, primarily on the east side of the city, you know, trying to articulate why neighborhood nodes work better in those areas, but not more on the west side. I'm struggling to do that for myself. You know, some of these nodes are ones I'm pretty familiar with, and I'm struggling with why is this still a neighborhood node when another one got eliminated, when that one they seem to be more equivalent. And so I think if that can get rationalized and articulated really strongly in the master plan, that's going to be a benefit to all of us. You know, particularly if eliminating a neighborhood node, well, what was it before in 2008, or what do we think it should be now? Maybe it's not exactly what it was in 2008, will also be helpful, because what I don't want our residents to feel is that, we're moving backwards, or that we're in a worse, they'll be in a worse spot than they were before, because that's not the intent. I think Planning Commission has done a lot to think through this, be really, really thoughtful about intention. And I feel like it doesn't necessarily all come out, like all that hard work. And so those are my primary concerns, or what I think will help move this forward a little bit. The last item I'll say is, master plan is likely to drive some zoning ordinance changes, or text amendment changes. And so if I'm gonna assume we're gonna adopt a plan sometime this year. What's the timeline then for any corresponding, text amendment language? Is it, a year or 2 years? What's the lag between the two? Because there's a lot of work that needs to be done with any ordinance changes.
Is that a question?
You can answer.
Okay.
2016 was a long time ago for me, so I don't remember.
No, we have a pretty good sense of basically if master plan gets adopted like it's drafted or close to. We think the proposed text amendments shouldn't take that long to come to
Okay.
that. Probably, I would hope within 6 months.
Okay,
The biggest challenge to that, though, are gonna be the rezoning of the nodes that we're taking out, the 6 nodes, because those have to go back to something, right? And what's the something that's an appropriate thing for them to be? So, I think those are the friction points, sorry.
Yeah.
But the other things that we're talking about doing, I think, are relatively easy tweaks, because I think we're all on the same page. This is the right direction that we should be going to make these changes. So it's more of a process than anything that we think is going to be real controversial.
those are my big ones.
Sure, I'm happy to go. I want to start by just giving some small things, and then I want to go back to the nodes and kind of the stickier issues. So what would make me comfortable before sending this out, approving it to be sent out, is, and I want to thank Councilmember Hamilton, who did a deep dive in editing. The professor in me was wanting to use the red marker, but I do want to see the typos fixed up in it. And it's in the headlines in some places as well, so just clean that up. I would love, I don't know if master plans do this, but to have some sort of executive summary, something that is just 1 to 2 pages that maybe highlights what's changed since the last master plan. Something that's very clear, very visible, very transparent, because I think the spirit of all this is transparency with our residents. Because it's a big doc. I was looking at the old one and trying to compare it with the new draft. Other thing is, there's language like around page 27 around, there's a lot of old stuff from the original one, learning committees that we should set up, and learning, I'm not sure that myself as a council, I feel like that's our domain. I know it's a visionary document, but I just think there's some stuff in there that maybe made sense back in the days, but I'm not sure it belongs there anymore. Even some of the economic information, we have, the Rural Economic Forum Innovation Center now, like that's not mentioned around page 36, 37, so I think there's some things there. In terms of bigger stuff like nodes, so I spent time kind of going over the changes. And just to confirm, so low scale, multiple family, that is duplexes and triplexes, is that right?
Yes.
And my understanding is a lot of the changes to those, as you explained writ large, is to kind of encourage mixed use or some development that is more along the lines of that. Is that right in most of them? Because it was interesting, I was looking at node J, that was where the Avoclara development that I denied, and partly because I was kind of arguing that it needed something lower scale, something that kind of was more concerned with buffering and all of that. And so that is what it's changed to in terms of the additions, it looks like. With node I, it talks about cemetery expansion into the nodes, so just wanted more clarification on that.
I believe the cemetery actually owns a parcel in the node right now.
Oh, do they?
So,
Okay.
that was part of, I think, their long-term plan eventually was to go
Okay.
into that parcel.
Other thing is, so with the duplexes, triplexes, so I'm happy to see that. I think that is a big thing and I was just speaking with neighbors about this a couple weeks ago, is the height is what's difficult for them, so we're solving for that by adding this in. But I think also what makes sometimes these developments stand out is kind of their design. And, you know, I'm thinking of both what Abathur was proposing in Node J, and then also the Staffa development, now that we can see it. When we went on our walk, it wasn't in place. Maybe, you know, that is all, it's all fun and good, maybe at Big Beaver, it's a very kind of cutting edge, kind of, you know, a hip design, but I have a feeling 10 to 20 years, I'm not sure the durability or the lasting sense of how those, even now, I just don't see how those developments fit in with what's around it, even with the 7-Eleven and the developments there. So it did make me think about, and I don't know if this is master plan, if it's ordinance down the road, is could we ever think about having design standards just in the nodes? Something that would have an impact, if you're building in the zones, whether it is, even if it's these duplexes and triplexes, is that something that ever happens? And is that a master plan matter, or is that something?
So we do actually have design standards or design language in the zoning ordinance now. Perhaps it's not strong enough to what you may want, but certainly that would be probably something, probably insert a little comment or two in the master plan about design quality, et cetera, but then you actually put it in the zoning ordinance to strengthen it up a little bit more. I think it's kind of both to tackle it. But there are design requirements in the zoning ordinance at this point.
So where are that? I'm just thinking more like, okay, if you're gonna build, it must be out of brick, it must be, and I know that sometimes there's hesitation, that can be a barrier to developers, but just in exchange, kind of, yeah, maybe it's just something to think about, so, because that is something that comes out, that neighbors say, it's like what they're seeing, what it's built out of. The roof is built like this. It doesn't fit with anything around it. The other thing with just the whole concept around the nodes that has been challenging, and I'll get to a question on it, is if they're meant to serve the neighborhoods, if there isn't anything more to encourage pedestrian walking from neighborhoods into the nodes, I know it's talked about, but I don't understand how the master plan, how do we incentivize that? Because if there's no, and also we don't control commercially what goes in those places, there's not more pocket parks. I think some of these developments are trying to create some of them and they're near nodes. And if you can't, I have a hard time. And I say that, we went to Kensington Church, my husband and I, our family, yesterday, and we were going through one of the nodes. My husband, there's nothing here. I'm like, oh, it's actually one of the nodes. And that's part of the challenge. We can't control kind of what's going in terms of, is there a shop that someone actually wants to go in and shop at? Are these roads actually pedestrian friendly? So I think on the pedestrian side, like, what can we do as a city to encourage more of a walkability? Because I think the Node J talks about the pedestrian element, but I don't know what, beyond saying it, what else can we've talked a lot in the city about making things pedestrian friendly, but I don't find we've always moved things forward.
Yeah, I think there's a two-part answer to your question. I think the first is, and we struggle where we have tried to connect neighborhoods to nodes. Now it's often the neighborhood that doesn't want the connection, and rightly so, because what's being built in the nodes doesn't enhance their neighborhood. So that's why getting back to the whole goal. So the nodes aren't new. This has been around for 15 years. Okay, so we're not recreating the wheel by changing the language there now. I think we're trying to go back to what the intent of what the nodes were supposed to be in 2008. I think by creating places that advance or help or support the adjacent neighborhoods, people will want to walk to them, and that increases pedestrian connections, and we can physically build in pedestrian connections. But if we're only getting right now developments that the neighborhood doesn't support, doesn't like, and it doesn't support the neighborhood, then there's no desire to have any connection. So I think it's almost like you need to build it first, and then it will happen. But that being said, we're always looking at making pedestrian improvements, so sidewalk improvements where we can, bicycle connections and improvements where we can. We've got the bike path trail coming from the dog park all the way up. So it's two-part. It's let's improve the land uses within the nodes from that perspective, and that I think will increase desire for pedestrian walkability. But two, we can build it too as we go, build the physical infrastructure as we go. So.
I think that was a good answer. I don't think she's fully satisfied with that, and I understand why, because I think it is a problem, and I understand we can't say, okay, well, we want a dry cleaner, a coffee shop, a flower shop, and a little cafe here. We can't do that. And that's the kind of things we need developers to do in order to make them a draw to the neighborhoods around them, right? Instead, we get ugly townhomes that, you know, that's been, I mean, right, that's been part of the issue, but absent being able to do that, it is a little bit, we're heavily dependent on the private sector to come in and say, hey, I think this will be a good business case for me to do that. It doesn't sound like there's anything we can do more to actually encourage a variety of, I mean, having an Edward Jones and an accountant and a lawyer in those spaces isn't going to draw people on to walk over there either, right? I mean, and that's, or a dentist office like by the 7-Eleven. I mean, those kind of things, and no offense to any of those businesses. I'm thankful for them being here. But you know what I mean? Like, so I guess the answer is there really isn't anything we can do from a master plan. I mean, we can't be the type that says you can only put this here. That's not going to fly. It's private property issues, and we don't want to get in the habit of that. We can say what we don't want. We don't have certain types of industries here, but is there anything more, I think, just to follow up one more time, is there anything more we can do, whether maybe not with this, but something we can look at coming out of this as well that would help encourage that? And if you need to think about it, that's okay.
I don't get myself in trouble, so I probably should think about it. But it's tough, and communities are struggling with this. I mean, every community is struggling with the same issue. You can be as specific as we only want retail, but you can't dictate what that retail may or may not be. We only want services, but you can't say, I would rather have a beauty salon versus a Edward Jones. No offense, Edward Jones.
Right, sorry, I mean, like.
Whoever. And you'll hear me say this, you may hear me say this before a lot. Zoning is very good at hindering markets. It's not good at creating markets, incentivizing markets. And so it's a pretty blunt tool from a economic development perspective. So we talk a lot about the master plan. I think how we can do it is just through we can tweak some of the land uses and say you have to have mixed use, you can't just have residential. I've seen communities do that, and it's worked. We can strengthen up design guidelines to make them better in terms of quality or in terms of better design. But there are limited tools in terms of what you can tell a private developer he has to build on his property other than what's allowed in the zoning ordinance. The other way to do it is you make everything a rezoning, a PUD, and then some negotiation, which I don't think anyone wants that either. Because that gets a lot of communities in trouble too. And so it's tough. We will certainly think about ways, but it's a struggle. And I'll just tell you from a market perspective right now too. I am not seeing anything built right now other than some fringe commercial stuff here and there, medical office and residential. There's no market right now to build much anything else right now. And so we can make all these rules, but if you can't build it, if you can't finance it, and there's no market for it, you're not going to build it right now. And so that's the struggle too, is we can raise zoning laws, but the market really dictates what happens in those. Sorry.
I know you asked a lot already in writing, but.
Right, no, and for me to move this forward, I need all those issues addressed. Definitely, I think we're in agreement there. And I agree with the Big Beaver stuff. It's something all of us have talked about for years. I think we need to see that as a part of this to move forward. I think that gives us at least 4 that are on board with that. I do think everything I'm seeing with the nodes, I think, is in the right direction. And I agree, I'd like to see something this year. But going through this document with a fine-tooth comb, I do think there are major long-term changes that I want to see. It's not something I think that can happen this year, because I think we need to get this done soon to get this node stuff locked in and get the zoning ordinance changed next year. But I'd like to see a better mechanism for us on council to, and maybe we can do this in the annual retreat we do every year, but to kind of bring up major changes to the master plan we'd like to see and kind of facilitate that process. Because I think talked with a lot of council members here that have a vision for where they'd like to see it, and I don't think it's changed as much as we'd like. I know it was said maybe in 5 years, that's the 20-year mark, but I feel like it might be time now in the next 2-3 years to do a major update, or maybe we can add a little bit every year to get us closer, but there's a lot of things I want to do, but I don't think right now is the time. I think the neighborhood nodes and Big Beaver are the critical issues that we need to change now, and we need to see that here. That's where I'm at now. I have a lot of other thoughts, but I'll save them for later.
No, that's good, David. I mean, I wrote this down when we were talking. I mean, I think, we're 2 years into this process, and I think during these past 2 years where we've been heavily focused on the neighborhood nodes and the Big Beaver issue and stuff that we knew was critical, I think a lot of new stuff has come forward. I think, Fabrice, obviously, the stuff you're talking about sustainability, it's hard 2 years into this process where at this point to do major overhauls on this specific thing. But that was kind of one of my questions of, absent another major overhaul of the master plan that wouldn't statutorily be required for 5 years to be looked at, I mean, and are there other mechanisms we can use to address some of that stuff without muddying up this process to a point where we've got developers and residents watching what we're doing and with their properties and with their neighborhoods, right? And we need to move through some of this stuff, but also some legitimate new things that have kind of changed in the world and, things we want to address. Lori?
I just wanted to say, you're gonna have to go through the same process.
I was just
though.
gonna say, yeah, every time you need the 60,
We'll need to do the public hearing, the 63 days, transmit it to all of the other entities.
But do all of these things have to be addressed through the master plan itself? That was my point. Is there other ways to, certainly, that was my, maybe it doesn't have to necessarily be piggybacked onto the master plan, but, and maybe something in the interim's done, but then when the master plan is done, the next time it's integrated or something. I'm just
that's a good point. And
totally
like
thinking.
Fabrice, like you mentioned, like you said, Sterling Heights has the EV master plan, or some communities have a solar master plan. So maybe that's the way you do it, is you have a separate process for things like that. But I've heard a lot of good ideas from council members and residents, and maybe we need to tie that process in to our annual review to maybe if we have any major zoning or master plan updates that are coming from council itself, like that we have a space for that every year. Maybe we don't do it every year, but it's something to keep in mind. But I know we need to move forward, and if the things I mentioned are covered, I'm willing to move along, but by no means do I think this document's where it needs to be long-term, but we're getting there.
Makes sense. I think the concern might be, I think sometimes we feel like if we don't do it now when we're given the option, it might get lost in the other things that come up in city business, and we might not have the opportunity. So or at least I feel some of that a little bit. So I understand the urgency feel and where you want to go from there. So that makes sense. So let's commit to continuing to address it and make sure we can.
Yeah, but the nodes in Big Beaver, that's like zoned differently than what we think it should be now, and I'd like to see that move on. I'm ready to do that, but. Okay. Cool. Ann?
Yeah. So, correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm hearing is, like, some of these issues, like height of building and the nodes, or transitions between Big Beaver corridor and abutting residential neighborhoods, a more effective means of dealing with these would be to change the zoning ordinances versus changing the master plan. Not that we couldn't do both, but from what I'm hearing, we talk about the master plan being an aspirational document, and the zoning ordinances, both the text and the map, are what have the more binding effect on what happens in an area. Is that accurate?
I'll answer from my planning perspective, and then I'll let the city attorney. The best way to enact a zoning ordinance change, especially from a defensibility standpoint, is have it consistent with your master plan. So we have to lay the base now of what we want to achieve in the zoning ordinance by these intent statement, vision statement, these descriptions per se, so that we can then make the change to the zoning ordinance to be reflective of that and actually enforce those policies. So that's just one smart plan into legal way to do it. Lori, I would assume you agree.
I do agree. I don't have anything to add
So
to that.
we always say, you plan first, you zone later.
Right.
So you update your zoning ordinance based after your master plan stuff.
Okay, so like for instance, just to use a specific example, one of the issues with the neighborhood nodes was height of residential buildings. And also an issue on the Big Beaver corridor as well. So what I'm hearing then is that should be addressed in the master plan, but we also, to make it have some force of law, we need to follow up with the zoning ordinance change.
Correct.
Correct, okay.
And that's where I was or the question I'd say within 6 months, we hope to bring that back to the
Okay.
council for adoption.
All right.
These changes.
So I would tend to agree that we need to reflect the Big Beaver corridor issues in our master plan as well. I think that we're leaving ourselves open if we don't address that. And then also follow that up with some ordinance changes that'll help strengthen that the issues of and I agree that the issues that are coming up, it isn't that people don't want development on the Big Beaver corridor, or they're opposed to most people are not opposed to all development in the neighborhood nodes. What they don't want is a 3-story apartment building overshadowing their 1.5-story ranch. And I completely get that. And that's something that hopefully we can, address both in terms of the aspirational language in the plan, but also tightening up our zoning ordinances. I think that's absolutely critical so that we don't run into those issues. And, but then speaking also of high-density housing, which is kind of a boogeyman for some people in the city, but it's also something that at least our developers are telegraphing to us is something that's in demand. We're seeing it on the Big Beaver corridor. We saw it, of course, in the neighborhood nodes, which was problematic. And I'm wondering where in either the existing master plan or in future master plans are we encouraging high-density housing in areas where it would be less problematic?
Well, there was discussion about it in the notes, and obviously that's become an issue. There is some discussion about on Big Beaver. There are multifamily zones and designations in the master plan and the zoning ordinance, but we don't specifically, I don't believe, talk about other locations in the city that would be appropriate for higher density housing.
So our existing master plan doesn't, it's obviously, there's areas like the Big Beaver corridor where people are able to build, high-density housing. We're seeing office buildings converted into high-density housing, and nobody's coming at us with torches and pitchforks about that. They're cool with that. I just want to make sure that we're eliminating these nodes, and they're probably not going to come back as an area appropriate for high-density housing in any way, shape, or form, because I can't imagine that that's going to fix the problem that is being brought to us. But I'm troubled by that we're losing that potential for having high-density housing in Troy. If we eliminate 6 nodes, we're now limiting even further areas where we can put in some high-density housing. So maybe there isn't a solution to that. I'm just throwing it out there that not everybody wants a traditional single-family standalone home. Some people prefer to have high-density housing, and I want to make sure that our city has that available for people.
We do have some areas in the city that are zoned for it, just necessarily have been built there per se. Is Maple Road allows for higher density housing. All the IB industrial districts allow for high density housing. The areas that don't allow for high density housing are really those areas kind of north of Big Beaver in the areas where you've got abutting other neighborhoods, where we're seeing the most pushback about high density housing. So it's another friction balance thing that every city faces. You want high density housing, but you want to make sure it's not impactful on the existing residents in a lot of ways, so.
Exactly.
And there's still opportunities with PUDs in other places. And what about in like the North Troy Crooks corporate area? I mean,
That's a good
see,
place.
to me, that seems like a great place for some high density housing that doesn't
We're
exist
getting that
now.
with
And there's
the
the
new
old
one.
Kelly Services
Yeah.
property that's there, but I mean, they're like the old Met property. There's a lot of opportunity
And in
there, I
the,
think.
the last master plan, we updated the North Troy special area plan to call out for more residential and more services there, other than just kind of the office park type of look and feel. So we are trying to address it in what we feel appropriate locations, that can kind of supplement the areas where you don't want it in the city.
Right, it's areas where there won't be that conflict with abutting neighborhoods. Okay. That's all I have.
To that point, the PUD approved at Long Lake and Crooks. The same people who are like, what are you guys doing at Node F and why are you doing it? Are like, okay, that makes sense. Where it makes sense, people are really receptive to it. They might not be thrilled that the old trees are gonna, the brush that's grown there is gonna go away. But once they recognize that isn't even quality brush, right, that's just overgrown field, they really like the PUD. I live over near all that, so I get the incidental conversations, and it's just, there is a difference between the properties that are bigger, that it makes sense for, versus the nodes. I think in 2008, that was resident driven. The whole node discussion was resident engagement driven. And the idea was coffee shops and what, Main Street at Disney World had all these nodes. Well, we can't force that to happen. It's not happening. And instead, we're getting density in places that arguably the roadways aren't even, it's not even necessarily that they don't want that in their backyard or that it's overlooking their house. They're looking at what's happening even from a safety perspective for the kids that do ride their bikes to 7-Eleven for a slushie, or people who walk there to get a newspaper. We've added a ton of traffic there. So there is a difference, and I hear you, and I do think we have to be intentional, continue to think in that way in other areas.
We're getting short on, well, we're kind of short on time. I have a question. And my one question I didn't ask, was there conversation, why aren't we eliminating the Crooks and Waddles node? We're eliminating 6 other ones, we're leaving it as a lone thing, and it doesn't look like it fits on the map. Is there reasoning behind that? I mean, a quarter of that node has been developed, or has been approved for everything.
Yeah, and then the other part of the cemetery is that other corner to it.
But
Here's,
not to be reactionary, but it's been a big point of contention in the city, and I know there's litigation, I know there's a million things, but to me, it seems like the language that we did adjust the language, it still seems overly subjective to me, and it puts us at further risk for more litigation.
Mr. Mayor, we obviously struggle with that one the most, both from a neighborhood, it was actually one of our neighborhood walks, and so we went with neighbors and talked to them. Steering commission, started with the planning commission. I think the question that we had is, if it's not neighborhood node, what does it go back to? It's not gonna go back to single family, and so it's gonna be open into one of your commercial districts, and the commercial districts perhaps would be more intrusive than what a future node could be. And so that was the struggle, is if it's not node, what then would it be rezoned to? Because you have
I'm not
to.
satisfied with that. See, that's my problem. Honestly, I mean, I hear that, and also I'm like, well, all these years later, that's where we're at. Okay, I mean, if you're the expert.
It has to be future land use plan to something.
Right.
Right? And it has to be zoned to something. We think with some of these changes to the nodes, perhaps some of the changes that we're gonna make to the zoning ordinance, we can be, from a development standpoint, be much, can approve a project that's much less impactful and serves the neighborhoods than what we could do under a general business or commercial business zoning designation.
Could it not? Why can't it be zoned residential?
It goes back to single-family residential. I don't see single-family residential being built on that busy corridor right there.
which to the neighbor says great, but, right, I mean, I hear that, but,
And if you're if you're a property owner on there, you own property and you go back from no designation of zoning to single-family residential,
There's
it's a
legal
big, significant
taking issues,
taking,
right?
potential
I
issue.
get that.
I gotcha. I
So-
just need to hear it
It's just,
said
is
out
there
loud.
a, I mean, I guess, just to double, I mean, if you feel that new language, and if council feels that new, not council, but council,
Yeah.
feels that language is sufficient to protect us in future issues and encourage the right kind of development and protect us and give us enough subjectivity or enough flexibility to approve or deny, but not so subjective that we're just gonna automatically get sued, I guess, to be very blunt. I mean, that's where it comes down for me, because, and again, then we have to be able to explain to the city why we didn't make too many changes to that, or the changes we did make, how those affect them.
I get it, we struggled with one the most, and it really came down to, let's hopefully make enough changes in this and in the zoning ordinance to protect us from, not just that node, but all the other nodes in the city. But we kept going back to, we kept talking about, well, if it's not a neighborhood node, what does it go to? And it's a bad answer, but it's a realistic, pragmatic answer as to, okay, what else would it be? And we couldn't find a future land use designation and a potentially rezoning to designation that wouldn't face legal challenge, market challenge, and is realistic. And neighborhood opposition when you take it to a general commercial or neighborhood commercial, which have much higher intensity of potential uses than what your neighborhood node allows now. Most of your general business are zoned on Rochester Road and off Big Beaver, where you have higher traffic volumes. So that's the unfortunate answer.
Okay. Where do we go from here then? You heard from 7 of us on things. I'm sure some of, typos are an easy fix.
Yep.
Bigger conceptual changes are not. I'm not sure I necessarily everyone made it and answered that initial question of what it would take. I mean, we don't want you to have to bring it back to a regular council agenda and have us say, no, we're not ready yet. So, right? I mean, I don't know from your standpoint, we don't need to decide right this minute, but we obviously don't want to leave it hanging out too long. If it's something you need to kind of, I guess I should look at you, work through some changes and then talk amongst yourselves and decide what you think would be best to bring back to us, because obviously we're not ready to say, okay, we're ready tonight.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Does that make sense with council?
Just to make sure I'm understanding, so you're gonna take the input that we gave. By the way, thank you for the redlining, thank you for the study session. We need to be able to say that to all these residents and all the engagement for a number of years that we did study this before releasing it. That really needed to happen on the nodes specifically. I'm personally comfortable with the idea that we can be releasing on the higher order visionary and in the 63-day through the engagement, continuing to finesse it. So are we saying that we want you guys to get it together so you can bring it back to us as soon as possible, bottom line?
I think so.
Yeah.
I
Are we
think
all on the
that's
same
what I think I
page?
heard council say.
Okay.
I think.
And I don't want to speak for city administration, but I think the changes that you're requesting are not gonna take us that much time to come back with you. So I think we can be back in front of you in short order with the changes as what I think I heard tonight.
Not to say.
And again, this is not the it. There's still opportunities after that to
Right.
keep
Right.
evolving it and amending it as necessary. Yeah.
And I do want to, like David was saying, I mean, some of these other bigger things, maybe it's an advanced conversation, but if you can keep that in the back of your notes, and Meg shaking her head too.
Those are always gonna exist, even in
Yeah.
2016, that's just always gonna be the case. But I hear you.
No, because since I've been on council, we haven't changed the master plan yet. So, and that was right after when you guys did the last major update, but, yeah,
A few things have happened.
yeah, so.
If there's anything more I'd like to do.
Just
but-
don't want you to think I'm disregarding what you're
No,
saying.
no.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else? And we don't have any other business, so. We'll adjourn. We have 15 minutes till our next meeting.
Okay. Thank you for your time, appreciate it. Yep.
Nice job, flying solo.
Thank you. Thank you.
And he always
I usually don't have someone like Brent next to me.